phrase cultural racism out in the public, then the first reference is going to be that Islam and democracy, well, just as an example, we're just using the image that you have there, that Islam and democracy are in some ways incompatible. And for that reason, Muslims won't be able to assimilate into the American life because of their devotedness to Islam and the Quran, etc. And so you can't be a Muslim and an American at the same time. And so therefore, I'm going to discriminate. I'm inside the head of this person. I'm going to discriminate against the Muslims because they are not us. They are not like us. And so it's not because you're black. It's not because you're Hispanic or Pakistani. It's just because you can't be an American. Your religion won't let you be an American. That's, the cultural racism, the rationale for the discrimination, right? It's really heavy in Europe and the like, where you have Muslims of all types. You look at France, look at all of them. They got the same kind of Tea Party-ish mindset or what have you over there working against Islam in their nations. But this is just that cultural racism. And you can see from those illustrations, the Union Jack, the Redskins, the whole thing. Are they still carrying that name, or did they change that? They're still carrying that. So you got those, they just said, no, we ain't letting go of that. It's a tradition. They fight, they get to the point where my racism is a cultural artifact. So therefore, you're trying to get me to stop being what culture has allowed me to be. Well, we're not really, it's not racist against the Redskins, So, but see, that's cultural racism, right? And again, that image of those when the schools were integrated and the like, you have those, this is a white man's world. It's a white culture. And so as a result, you can't assimilate into this culture just because you're not white. It's not your race, it's just you just don't have the cultural sensibilities. Like blacks can't play golf, Bilal. It's just like, and you can't play tennis, and you can't, all these small ball white man games, right? So, to take a piece from our sister Frances Cress. So, in any case, moving on. So, American racism, let's look at how it, we're going to look at. So there's this particular brand of racism that is American racism. So in order to follow this and to understand its distinction, we want to look at how ideologies are perpetrated and perpetuated. Now, Dr. George Frederickson, he's Professor Emeritus at Stanford University, he said, racism does not require the full and explicit support of the state and the law, nor does it require an ideological center on the concept of biological inequality. Discrimination by institutions and individuals against those perceived as racially different can long persist and even flourish under the illusion of non-racism. Okay, go back to the letter that we read, or that part of the letter that we read from Frederick Douglass to Ida B. Wells, which says that crime has the ability to perpetuate itself and create conditions necessary for its survival. That's my paraphrase of it. Okay, well, that's what cultures do. That's what once a culture comes into place, it self-perpetuates. So in the same way, so if you have a racist culture, or if you have cultural racism, once it becomes cultural racism, then it becomes self-perpetuating. Okay, so we want to understand how we walk up from point A to that point where racism is instantiated in the culture itself. So, and this is how we'll follow it. It goes down these 6 steps. First, there's a problem. Then instincts are applied to the problem. Then those instincts applied to the problem come up with an idea. And then that idea is formulated or formalized into an ideology. And then that ideology is instantiated or is established or structured as an institution. Shukran. As an institution. And then finally, those institutions actually represent what creates the culture itself. And those little letters there is what you'll be able to follow through as the slides go through That's each one of these 6 things laid out by acronym. PIIIC. So we're going down each one of those. So first, what was the problem? What was the problem for the 13 colonies? We're talking about American racism. What was the problem for the 13 colonies that became America? Their problem was how to compete in the world of growing industrial capitalism. That was the problem. That was the problem for the South. The imagery that I have right there is the imagery of John Henry. So you can look up the ballad of John Henry and the like. It was the black man against the steam engine. But that's nothing but slavery versus industrialism. The transition from the agricultural era for the South and the industrial age that had actually come in. The South was actually behind the learning curve for whatever reason. It could be a number of reasons, but most certainly they weren't ready to give up their slaves because that was obviously cheaper than machinery from their perspective. But the whole legend of John Henry is about that particular combat. So that was a problem that needed to be solved. To understand what the Industrial Revolution actually was and when it actually started, and that is, the Industrial Revolution was the transition to new manufacturing processes in the period from 1760 to sometime between 1820 and 1840. That was the beginning of the industrial age, the Industrial Revolution, right? And think about where slavery was, especially slavery in America. Where was slavery in America at that time? They were at the height of what they were doing. I mean, they were, cotton and all the rest of that, tobacco and all these things. They were at the height of making that money using slavery. Well, there was already an industrial revolution that was going on, which in fact actually was coming to an end 1840. So this transition included going from hand production methods to machines, new chemical manufacturing and iron production processes, improved the efficiency of water power, the increasing use of steam power, and the development of machine tools. It also included the change from wood and other biofuels to coal. So this was a transition that had serious impact for those whose income and those abilities were dependent upon slavery. That's a problem, all right? So what happens? What happens in the process is that once you're faced with a problem, then your instincts, whoever has those particular instincts, go to work on that particular problem. When there's a political problem, people of political instincts go to work on the problem. The Thomas Jeffersons, the James Madisons, the Benjamin Franklins, Alexander Hamiltons, all those people, they were operating at the political end and looking at the political problems between the 13 colonies and King George. And so they went to work to come up with the wherewithal or the means by which they can deal with that particular problem. Well, you have people of economic instincts, they focused on the problems that they faced in the economic area. And you also have all the others. You have the religious, you have the cultural, the academic. Always there's instincts, there are instincts that are operating to solve whatever particular problem. We're just zeroing in on the ones who were driving the economy in America using slave power. It was a problem. The transition from the industrial age, it was a problem for their keeping up with the globalization of capitalism and the industrialization of capitalism. So those instincts went to work to discover the means for solving that particular problem. And this was the idea they landed upon. They settled upon the idea of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery was a choice. That this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to compete. And that meant, of course, we need more slaves. The slave is the crude oil. What crude oil is now, and those who continue to use what you call fossil fuels and the like, in the same way, slavery, we're not going to let go of slavery. Like right now, America doesn't have to depend on oil the way that America depends on oil right now, but because there's so much oil available from these other countries that we can take and can get cheaper, we're not going to mess with these other methodologies until we have used as much as we can of this former method. So you find them buying patents and keeping products on the shelf so that it don't interrupt their petrochemical business, right? And then when it's time for them to just get off that, they're going to just get off that and move on to something else, or move on to whatever the latest thing is. But capitalizing on what's already here and there available, that's exactly the same kind of thing that happened in the South. So that was the idea for the South, to keep it. So now you remember, the North industrialized before the South industrialized, right? So the North was already in the Industrial Revolution, right? But again, the South was behind the learning curve in that sense. And so the idea of Northern carpetbaggers and the Civil War and all that, listen, follow the money, follow the money. It wasn't because Abraham Lincoln said they need to be free. No, you find many quotes related to him and say, I never intended for black folks and white folks to be equal. If there was any way for me to do this without ending slavery, I would do it. But I got to win the war. And if freeing the slaves is what will win the war, well, that's why I'm doing it. I'm not doing it because I'm just so in love with black people. I mean, just get it straight, right? That's a clear example of how the South was trying to keep doing business the way it did business against the transformation of economy that was happening globally. So slavery, quote unquote, died this slow and horrible death in the South, but it was all more than anything, it was all economics. So the unique place that chattel slavery plays in the world, and this is critical to understand, that the kind of slavery that was happening in the South was not like any other slavery that ever happened anywhere else in the world. This is just like you talk about America and having a president. See, when we talked about 1776, when late 18th century, when they said we're going to have a republic, that was a totally new idea. Everywhere else there were kings and queens. So that was a totally new idea. Okay, well, even the slavery of America was a totally different kind of slavery. The traditional slavery was one where it wasn't based on race. It included whites. You know about the indentured servitude even here in America. They could be, the domestic worker or the soldier could actually be a slave in traditional slavery. And they are still seen, however, as persons, and they were not taken as the property of their master, and then manumission, the ability to earn or win your freedom or buy your freedom was possible in traditional slavery. Okay, well, here comes the slavery in the South, in America, chattel slavery, different than any other slavery anywhere in the world, where it was based on race, it didn't include whites, it was solely for profit. It was totally dehumanizing. That is, the total dehumanization of the slave was a part of the process. In fact, Imam Muhammad, this is what we still suffer from, rahimahullah alayh. The Imam said, we were subject to an experimental clinic designed to cause us to dysfunction in the vital areas of our lives. We were put into an operation that took out of us all of those organs that would allow us to operate and cooperate in a way that normal human beings do. And we have inherited that dysfunction generation after generation after generation. And that's what has to be corrected. And it can be and will only be corrected by a new set of ideas engendered into the predisposition of the people, and then sit down by inheritance to the next generations and institutionalize to reinforce and to bring out those potentials that they acquire by their DNA from the predisposition of parents born or having that consciousness when they birth the child. Wallahi, I'm telling you, Venus and Serena Williams and the Polgar sisters, go study their history. See how they came into being. They came into being by their father's disposition for their being where they are right now. But they had to create the conditions both by genes and by memes for them to be able to, by nature and nurture, in order for them to be able to achieve what we're seeing them achieve right now. And that can be done for a whole people, but you have to have parents that are willing to enter into that, quote, experiment. Okay? So in any case, so the idea of being totally dehumanized and becoming the property of the